Everyone, is Chow here, and today we are going to briefly talk about circulation. This is an extremely watered down version, so what we're going to discuss is the flow of blood as well as a little bit of regulation of arterial pressure. So let's get started. Okay, so I think this section you should have a pretty good idea of. It's usually a topic that's also covered in much more detail in lab, so that's a place where you should definitely pay attention to. But in regards to circulation and the circulatory system, basically we have three main components. We have the heart, which acts as your muscular pump to pump the blood. And then we also have blood vessels, which act as your passageways for the blood to flow. And then obviously the fluid in our case is the blood itself. So basic overview of the components of the circulatory system, also known as the cardiovascular system. So if we're looking at the heart itself, mammal hearts actually have four different chambers. So we have two atria and two ventricles. So we have ventricles over here and then two atria over here. So one ventricle, two ventricle, and then atria number one, atria number two. There are actually some animals, such as reptiles, that only have three. So you can look at these chambers from maybe an evolutionary perspective. But from a physiological perspective, we're looking at the circuits of this circulation system. So there are actually two different circuits or pathways of blood flow. We have the systemic circuit, which is actually pumping of blood from heart to the body. So down here, this is the systemic circuit down here. We also have the pulmonary circuit, which is basically pumping blood from the heart to the lungs and then back to the heart. So this up here, right, that over there is the pulmonary circuit. So pulmonary circuit is up here, right? Blood from heart to lungs, back to heart. And then down here is the systemic circuit, which is blood to rest of the body and then back to the heart. So there you go. Okay. Just checking my notes to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, doesn't look like it. Okay, so again, when you're looking at these two pathways, you can see whether the blood is going to be oxygenated or deoxygenated. But when you're looking at this particular circuit over here, for instance, the systemic circuit, you have the left ventricle. So keep in mind we're looking at it from this heart, the system from a ventral view. So the left side is actually here, and the right side is from here. So we're actually looking at kind of the belly of the person. And what's going on is you have the left ventricle over here that's pumping the blood from the left ventricle through the aorta into the systemic circuit to the rest of the body. So it brings the oxygenated blood, which is shown in red here, to the rest of the body, and then eventually the blood goes over here, and then eventually goes back to the heart into the right atrium. And there are actually some like vena cavas here that are going to help out with that process. But the blood leaves, right, the left ventricle in the systemic circuit, goes to the rest of the body, and then comes back in through the right atrium. Okay. Now we also have the pulmonary circuit, which is going to be up here, and the pulmonary circuit is going to start right over here with the right ventricle. So the right ventricle pumps the blood through this pulmonary semilunar valve over here, and it's going to go into the lungs eventually. So it brings deoxygenated from the heart to the lungs. The blue here is deoxygenated because the oxygen was used up in the rest of the body. So the deoxygenated blood goes from the right ventricle up into these capillaries over here in the lungs, and then they regain oxygen, that blood in the lungs, and that's going to loop back and enter through the left atrium. So that's the pulmonary circuit up here and the systemic circuit down here. Okay. So when we're looking at the flow through these passages, there are actually a couple of different types. We have arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. The largest ones are your arteries and veins, and then, of course, the smallest ones are your capillaries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, and then veins carry blood towards the heart. So again, arteries carry blood away from heart, and veins carry blood towards the heart. So that should make pretty straightforward sense. In terms of exchange of materials, so if we're talking about exchange of materials, like maybe oxygen, something like that, it really only happens in the capillaries. The capillaries in the body are actually the site of exchange between the blood and the tissues around. So that's pretty important. Okay. Now, if we're talking about circulation, one of the things that we talk about is this concept of blood pressure. So in sort of daily health, we talk about high blood pressure as a bad thing. But what exactly are we talking about when we say blood pressure or when we measure blood pressure? We're actually measuring the mean arterial pressure. So in terms of the mean arterial pressure, there are actually ways to regulate it, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about. But in terms of regulating arterial pressure, there are often hormones that can be produced to help upregulate it or downregulate it. So one of the hormones that's produced in the adrenal medulla is epinephrine. So epinephrine is released oftentimes in response to falling arterial pressure or during the fight or flight response by the sympathetic nervous system. And it leads to arterioles contracting. The contraction of these arterioles means you have an increase in blood pressure. Likewise, that also allows for an increase in blood flow to essential areas of the body, again, in preparation potentially for fight or flight. We also have angiotensin, which is produced when blood supply to the kidneys fails. And when this happens, this angiotensin is going to be released, and through some mechanisms, it's going to reduce the flow to peripheral tissues, and it actually directs that blood flow to the essential organs. Ultimately, it can actually stimulate thirst, which can increase blood pressure in, I guess, not so much the proximate sense, but perhaps in the ultimate sense. And then finally, last but not least, we have ADH, or the antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin. And the antidiuretic hormone, aka vasopressin, is released in response to low baroreceptor activity. And this release of the hormone ADH by the posterior pituitary actually is going to allow your kidneys to absorb more water. So it pulls more waters out of the whole nephron system. And by increasing the water supply in your body, you're actually going to ultimately increase blood pressure. So you have arterial pressure, and there are actually different hormones and ways to kind of regulate the process. Obviously, the key thing here in this discussion is still probably this in regards to the whole system and how the blood actually is circulating. So if you want more information in regards to circulation patterns, as well as what exactly happens within the heart, as well as the parts of the heart, that's generally something you're going to get towards the latter half of your laboratory experience. So ultimately, there are some interesting things that we can discuss, but I'm just going to, as I mentioned, go over some of the basic details. So ultimately, I hope you found this at least mildly useful, and as always, best of luck studying, and I will see you in the next video.